Hello, everybody. Almost a year ago, I had my friend Jamie Kirchik on the show talking about a piece that he wrote for Liberty's Quarterly, From Queer to Gay to Queer. It was a controversial piece, in some ways upsetting some of his friends, associates in the gay community. And Jamie is back with another bombshell. He is, of course, the author of Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington, which wasn't a controversial book in many ways. But his new piece in the New York Times a few days ago, an opinion piece, he writes occasionally for them, "A chill has fallen over Jews in publishing," has aroused a great deal of controversy. Jamie is joining me from his... Where are you, Jamie? You're not in jail, are you?
No, I'm in Washington, D.C.
In a carefully concealed bunker, it looks like. So,
Yeah.
Jamie, you've... and of course, you knew you were going to upset people with this one. "A chill has fallen over Jews in publishing." Sounds like the kind of... headline my grandmother may have made up. What exactly is happening, and what are you arguing in this piece?
Well, since October 7th, there's been across America in many progressive spaces, obviously in academia, in the Democratic Party, in the nonprofit world, and also in publishing, there's been a rising anti-Zionism. And we can have a separate debate over whether or not anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but it's a very combative and encompassing anti-Zionism. And it brooks no distinctions between liberal Zionists who support a two-state solution and far right-wing Zionists who want great. And there's been a number of actions taken by several influential institutions, ranging from literary agencies and literary organizations, nonprofit groups that have basically issued statements, and writers have come together issuing statements against the war in Gaza, using somewhat anti-Semitic language, I would say. And what really sparked this was a list that was published online a couple weeks ago on a Twitter account, 200 writers, and it had a color-coded identity system to identify various authors as being Zionists. And it had a little explanation of why an author was a Zionist. And many of these classifications were very tenuous. If a writer visited Israel, they might be cited as a Zionist. In one case, they're linked on her Instagram account on October 7th or 8th. She provided a link to the Israeli chapter of the Red Cross and encouraged her followers to donate. That earned her basically the mark of Cain, if you will. And I say the biggest scandal that's been unfolding, or the biggest controversy, has been with the organization PEN, which is the international writers organization. That's the American chapter of that. And there have been a series of attempts to basically boycott the organization from within by its own members. And I should say here, I'm a member myself. They are continually pressing the organization PEN to call what's going on in Gaza right now a genocide, right? I mean, PEN has issued dozens of statements about the situation, about various Palestinian writers and their condition right now during the war. That has not been sufficient for these dissenters within the organization. They want PEN to basically come out and declare themselves to be an anti-Zionist organization, and to use this word genocide. They've called for the resignation of the CEO of PEN, saying that she has long-standing ties to Zionism. This woman happens to be Jewish, or I shouldn't say happens to be, she is Jewish. And I don't think that that's coincidental that they're attacking her for that reason. And they're basically creating within the literary world a litmus test. Are you a Zionist or an anti-Zionist? And considering the fact that the vast majority of Jews in this country and the vast majority of Jews around the world are Zionists, this is a litmus test that the vast majority of Jews would not pass. And it's a very troubling development. It is the sort of behavior that you expect of commissars in a dictatorship. Drawing up lists and demanding that people say certain things and sign up to certain ideas, whether or not they agree with them. It's a violation of conscience. This is not the behavior that we should be seeing in a free society.
So, Jamie, you're an outspoken critic of woke culture. This is a piece of it, or this is what some people might interpret as a piece of it. It sounds to me, especially in publishing, where there are many, many storms in a teacup, that it's just another symbolic debate within a fairly privileged community, and that it doesn't really matter. Why should we care about this?
I disagree. I think publishing is a very influential industry. It's one of our great, sense-making institutions alongside, the media, academia. And the people that I spoke to for this, few of whom wanted to go on the record, but I spoke to one author who said that, they are very fearful of how their next book will be received. It's a novel that has nothing to do with Jews, but this author had in the past won the Jewish Book Award, and that will be on this author's bio. And this author told me that they are very worried about the reception of this book, not because of the content of it, but because of the fact that this person is publicly and proudly Jewish. I spoke to a very high power, influential literary agent who told me that selling Jewish themed books by proudly open Jewish authors is extremely difficult in this market. So I take that as a very bad sign, not just for Jews, but for the entire book reading community. If people are being discriminated against, or they feel fearful of saying what they want to say because of all this anti-Semitism that's brewing in this literary community, I think that's a very bad sign for our society.
As I said, Jamie, you're the author of Secret City, about the hidden history of gay Washington in the 1950s. How, in your view, is what's happening today with Jewish authors, or what you argue is happening today, similar to what happened in the 1950s with gay Washington and gay America?
Well, there are some similarities and differences. I think the difference is that in the early decades, in the 50s and even well into the 60s, there were very few openly gay people, certainly not in Washington, in national politics. And so, gay people had much less influence and much less, space to talk about themselves and make their case than Jews do now. Jews are very widely represented in all areas of American life. So that's a major difference. But I would say a similarity is that with homophobia and anti-Semitism is the conspiratorial nature of it. You saw people in the 1950s talking about a homosexual international, the Comintern, which was similar to the Comintern, right? The Communist International. And the Comintern was said to be this international secret conspiracy of gay men who all helped each other, who all helped advance themselves within institutions. And they had this common bond. They were united by this perversion, that's what united them. It sounds very similar to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, frankly, right? That you have this community, this transnational community of people who are not loyal to the countries in which they live. They're loyal to some other state or entity, right? They're loyal to themselves, but not to the countries they live in. They are operating in secret machinations to undermine the societies in which they live. Both gays and spoken of as if they're a virus. So there's a lot of similarities, I think, in the bigotry that used to be expressed towards gay people, and still is in some sense. If you talk about, if you see some of these initiatives against, certain states, against certain LGBT-themed books, but that's mostly gone now. That sort of homophobia, at least in America. You hear it a lot in Eastern Europe and Russia and Africa and the non-Western part of the world, but you don't hear it much in America. But it has a lot of similarities with the conspiratorial nature of anti-Semitism.
Jamie, you probably don't know of a man called Mario Balotelli. You're probably not a big football fan, but there's an Italian footballer called Mario Balotelli. He was always getting himself into trouble. He played in England and in Italy, always getting in fights with other players, fans, the administration of the clubs he played with. And one time he scored a goal and he took off his T-shirt, and underneath was another T-shirt that said, "Why always me?" In other words, why is he, Balotelli, always the one in trouble? Why? And you're not the first. This is not the first or last time I've asked this question. I'm sure you've dealt with it many times. What is it then, in your view, about quote unquote the Jews that make them so vulnerable and visible to the kind of stuff that you're writing about in this op-ed in the New York Times? Is it because they're more visible, more powerful, wealthy, smart, or just because they're a three-letter word beginning with J?
Well, there's various types of anti-Semitism and various reasons for them. I think the sort of left-wing progressive anti-Semitism that is going on in the publishing world that I wrote about has a lot to do with this Manichaean oppressor versus oppressed ideology that we've been hearing about for a long time. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is seen through this very simple prism of Israel being portrayed as a colonial occupier. Israelis are seen as the white country in like apartheid South Africa. Never mind the fact that most Israelis would not pass for white in any Western country. But Israel fits that role of the white country, the Palestinians of the brown country. And in this very simplistic hierarchy that the left has created, the whites are at the top, and the browns or the blacks, the dark-skinned people are at the bottom. And that's how they see it. It's very simple. With much else of the world, I think it really originates from Christian anti-Semitism, right? Which is that the Jews rejected Christ, and they rejected Christendom. And it wasn't until the 1960s that the Catholic Church, reversed itself on its anti-Semitism. But that's almost 2 millennia, right? And so this is so deeply baked into Western society, anti-Semitism is, that I think so many people, including many people who are atheists or not religious at all, including on the left, they say and do things and they don't even realize that they're babbling anti-Semitism. When they, it's this Jewish rejection. The Jews have always rejected various forms of belief. They rejected Christianity. They rejected kings and queens and various, royal rulers. Their connection, their ultimate authority was God, right? During the century, they rejected communism. I mean, there were many Jews who became communists, but they had to reject their Jewish identity in order to do that. And so that's where the kind of left-wing anti-Semitism comes in, right? Is that the Jews had this other belief system. And that's why they were so oppressed in communist societies. And now, the Jews, many of the Jews reject the left's new religion, which is the religion of DEI and wokeness, if you will, for lack of a better expression. And a lot of Jews are uncomfortable with that. And for that reason, they are now being attacked. In the Islamic anti-Semitism. Go ahead.
Is that a dangerous assertion to suggest that somehow Jews are more representative in the anti-woke movement than other groups, other religions, other people?
Well, I think more Jews are more represented. Look, they're represented beyond their number in almost every pursuit. I mean, you can come up with a whole bunch of left-wing names of Jews, left-wing organizers, communists, socialists, but you can also come up with Milton Friedman, and you can come up with Hayek. I'm not sure if Hayek was Jewish, and Rand, right? There are plenty of conservative, but there are plenty of conservative Jewish figures too. So Jews are more represented in various pursuits of life, particularly in the sciences, certainly in Hollywood, which the Jews created. The Jews are just an active people. They're just in philosophy, in all sorts of realms, certainly in publishing, which is what I've been writing about. So it's hard to say that the Jews were responsible for Bolshevism because they were also blamed for capitalism and for stealing and for being, wealthy thieves and sucking dry society, and for being the captains of finance, right? And there's no truth to any of these claims. Yes, there are a lot of Jews in finance, there are a lot of Jews in Hollywood, but there's no weekly meeting where they're all gathering to plot something. So I do think that is a part of this anti-Semitism as well. The Jews are represented beyond their numbers, well beyond their numbers, in so many fields. And there are maybe two types of people who look at that. There's the type that says, I resent these people because there's so many of them. And there's the type that says, that's pretty impressive. How can we model ourselves, or what can we learn from this culture that leads to so many Jews being so prominent in so many fields? And I think America, for the most part, has always been in that second category. America has long been the most philo-Semitic society, certainly the best society where Jews have thrived in Jewish history. It's starting to change. It's starting to change for the worse. And you're seeing that in the publishing world. And that's something that I talk about in the piece. But this obsession, this attack on meritocracy, because meritocracy has been very good for the Jews. It was meritocracy that got Jews
that's
into the
idea. I'm going to put that as my title. Meritocracy has been good for the Jews.
Yeah, I would say more than any other group. I think more than any other group. I mean,
more than any other group. But again, Jamie,
I would think
in danger of turning the Jews into a special people, a chosen people, which is the very reason why so many people pick them out. I mean, has meritocracy been better for the Jews than it has for African Americans who were in slavery?
Well, if you,
I mean, whether
I don't think
or
it's
not
been
we
as
really
good
have a meritocracy in America, but
right.
Has it been better?
I just think if you look at fields that are based on merit, Jews have done exceptionally well. Also, by the way, Asians. It's probably been better for Asians, actually. And I only say that because Asians have been more recent immigrants to this country. And Asians are in many ways
offended or complimented by that.
Well, I think Asians are the I think Asians are the new Jews in that sense. Asians are the new Jews in this sense, in that this attempt to eliminate merit and replace it with quotas is hurting Asian students the most. That's why these lawsuits that have been brought against Harvard and Yale and other prestigious institutions were brought by Asian Americans, because they are the ones who lose out when merit is replaced with quotas.
So we've got two alternative titles for this interview, Jamie. We'll have to figure out which is the best. Either Asians are the new Jews or meritocracy has been good for the Jews. Certainly, when it comes to media, not all publications, not all new publications are against the Jews. Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, put out by our mutual friend, Jamie and I, my mutual friend, Leon Wieseltier, is anything but anti-Semitic. It's an excellent publication, so good, in fact, that Jamie publishes in it. And they support great guests on our show like Jamie. Going to run a short feature, and then we'll be back with Jamie to talk more about why a chill has fallen over the Jews, maybe not just in publishing, but broadly in the world of post-October 6th. So we'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking to my friend James Kirchik. He's no longer Jamie. James Kirchik, author of A Chill Has Fallen Over the Jews in Publishing. Jamie, last week I had a historian on, actually the former president of Brandeis University, has a new biography of Chaim Weizmann out. And he noted that Weizmann himself later in his life turned into an anti-Zionist. He wasn't particularly, even if he was the first prime minister of Israel and someone who was enormously influential in the publication of the Balfour Declaration. How do we, and you mentioned Zionism and anti-Semitism. This is something that gets brought up time and time again. Can one be an anti-Zionist and not be anti-Semitic? You noted that the vast majority of Western Jews are Zionists, but some aren't. Can one be against Zionism but not against Jews?
I think on a philosophical level, if you oppose all nation states, then that might be a way to be not anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. But I don't see how the dismantlement of the only Jewish state in the world and what the consequences of that would be. I think the consequences would be October 7th on a massive scale. I don't know. I mean, that is functionally, that is, practically anti-Semitic. If you want to see that happen, and I don't care if you don't think it'll happen, it will happen. There's no way that you allow all the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza Strip to just, flood into Israel, and something horrific doesn't happen at this point. I don't see how that's not anti-Semitic.
I'm not sure if you answered my question, though. Can one be against? So you're saying that if you're against Zionism, you are consciously or otherwise against Jews?
Yes. I mean, half the world's Jews live in the state of Israel.
But you could be opposed to Zionism and not opposed to.
What does opposed to Zionism mean? No, I'm sorry. To be an anti-Zionist is to believe that the state of Israel should not exist. A Jewish democratic homeland, a Jewish state should not exist. So it's replaced with a Palestine, right? And that there's no border, and that all the people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean are citizens of one country, which means I think that would be an Arab majority state or close to one.
So you're saying that if Israel, and this obviously isn't going to happen, but if it was dramatically transformed so that it no longer became a state built on its Jewish identity and became a place where anyone could go, Arabs, Jews, Christians, whoever, even Asians, the new Jews, then that would result, what, in the massacre of Jews, another October 6th?
I think it'd be civil war.
So
I don't see any.
The only way, so what you're saying is that any self-respecting Jew, any Jew who cares about being Jewish or other Jews, has to be a Zionist.
I think any decent person, regardless of their faith, has to be a Zionist. Just understanding the history of the Jewish people, and also just understanding what people are allowed to. What is owed to people, right? To peoples. I believe in a Kurdish state as well. I believe that Tibet should be an independent state. I believe peoples have a right to national self-determination. It's the reason why I believe that there should be a Palestinian state too.
That I don't want to get into another debate about the origins of Israel and the land and blah, blah, blah. But it's a little more complicated than simply saying, well, I believe in a Kurdish state, so I believe in a Jewish state. Because no one else is claiming the Kurdish state.
Yeah, well, I believe that the land should be divided in half, which is what was offered to the Palestinians in 1948. And they rejected it just as they have rejected every attempt at a two-state solution since then. So I personally think that what lies at the root of this conflict is the Palestinians' rejection of a Jewish presence anywhere in the Middle East. That is what I believe ultimately is at the root of this conflict. And only when the Palestinians—
There's a long history, Jamie. Again, this isn't your area or even mine, but there's a long history of reasonably good relations between Muslim Arabs or Muslim people and Jews, particularly in the light of the Crusades and the violence of Christianity. Are you suggesting that the Muslims of the Middle East or of Palestine have changed? What's happened?
I'm not an expert on the history of the Islamic world, but the Anti-Defamation League does annual surveys, the Pew does annual surveys, and the anti-Semitic attitudes of Muslims around the world are just through the roof. I mean, they just widely held beliefs of conspiratorial anti-Semitic nature. These are widely held among Muslims.
Why is that?
I think for the same reason, perhaps, that anti-Semitism among Christians for hundreds of centuries, and I also think a lot of it does have to do with the obsession, the anti-Israel obsession, right? That you have all these propagandists in Arab countries and Muslim countries. It's a good way for these governments to distract from their own failures, to distract their people from their own corruption, their own problems, deep-rooted problems, is to have this scapegoat of the Jews, the Zionists. And basically, Jews are the global scapegoat. The Jews, there's anti-Semitism in every corner of the world, including places where there are no Jews. I'm not aware of another bigotry that exists like that. That there, countries with no history of Jews, that you will find large portions of the population have anti-Semitic attitudes. I'm not aware of any other group of people that's hated like that.
Except for Mario Balotelli. We shouldn't bring Mario in because I get into trouble on that one. Although,
and I would note, Andrew, that the Holocaust happened, or it ended 3 years before the creation of the State of Israel. So this notion that the Jews don't need a state because they'll be fine without one, and they were fine in history until the State of Israel was created, just completely ignores the fact that the worst mass killing in human history, probably the worst thing ever to happen to humanity, happened before the State of Israel was created.
So are you arguing, Jamie, that there's a strong tradition amongst left-wing Jews of anti-Zionism, not anti-Jewish Zionism, anti-Semitic Zionism, but a hostility to the idea of Jews living in one place, certainly before the State of Israel, a commitment to progressive politics and internationalism? Are you suggesting that that entire tradition, which still exists, there are still many Western Jews demonstrating against Israel? I don't think they're anti-Semitic, or it's fair to call them anti-Semitic. Are you saying that they were entirely wrong?
The anti-Zionist Jews?
Well, left-wing Jews who have always been hostile or ambivalent or suspicious of Zionism. And there's a long tradition. I mean, back in the late 19th century, early part of the 20th century, it was as rich an intellectual tradition as Zionism, if not more.
I think, and what changed the attitudes of many of those people was the Holocaust. It changed a lot of Jews' attitudes, including many of whom were strongly anti-Zionist. Once the Holocaust happened, it became clear that there was a need for a Jewish state. As for today, I think a lot of these people, I would to crib something that Lawrence Summers said, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic in effect, if not in intent, right? So that, again, someone can be philosophically anti-Zionist, they can say they don't believe in this state called Israel, that there shouldn't be a Jewish state, but the actual practical consequences of that policy would result in the death of massive numbers of Jewish people, and would be anti-Semitic. So that's how I would describe it.
Jamie, if someone had fallen asleep in 1948 and woken up and started watching this, they would imagine that Israel, the state of Israel, whatever that means, is a scrappy little place surrounded by enormously powerful, well-armed Arabs. But it's indisputable that Israel is a military superpower, certainly a superpower in the region. It's way more powerful than its neighbors. It's fought a series of wars and always defeated those neighbors. It's heavily armed by the US. Aren't the Palestinians, you talk about the Asians as the new Jews, aren't the Palestinians the new Jews?
No, that's a really crude comparison, actually. That implies that the Palestinians are being subjected to a genocide like the Holocaust. I mean, that's just a morally grotesque comparison.
No, I didn't say that.
No, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. You're saying that they're the underdogs now, but it's just this idea is so prevalent in
David's
left-wing.
versus the Goliath, borrowing some terms from the Old
Fine.
Testament?
Well, I would say all those weapons and arms were not able to prevent the worst slaughter of Jewish people since the Holocaust, which was October 7th. So, Israel is not as strong as we thought it was. And I would say this war is an existential war. If Hamas is allowed to stand after this war, then Israel will have lost its deterrence power. It will be considered that they were defeated by this, ragtag band of terrorists. The Arab states that were on the verge of normalizing relations with Israel, like Saudi Arabia, extremely important, probably the most important Muslim country in the world, because it's the host of the most holy Muslim sites. That could be scratched. That could be stopped by this attack. You have Hezbollah on the north, which has the capacity to rain a lot of destruction in Israel, in major cities, in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Israeli population centers. And by the way, most of the people in the north, 7 months after October 7th, are still living in central Israel. They've all been evacuated from the north because there's a danger from Hezbollah. So that's what Israel has to live with right now. And that's not a way for a functioning, advanced democracy to live. And I haven't even mentioned Iran yet, which is, I just read yesterday, they're only a week away from potentially having a nuclear weapons capability, which would, have a hugely deleterious effect on not just Israel's power in the region, but the entire region and all of the American Israeli allies, Egypt, Jordan, all the Sunni states that are part of this kind of American axis would have that to deal with. They'd have a nuclear-powered Iran to deal with. So, sure, Israel on paper and in reality is much more powerful than any other country in the region, but it's not so powerful that it can sort of rest on its laurels and just not even try to defend itself. It's still on the front lines.
I've heard this phrase before, Jamie, that October 6th was the worst slaughter of Jews. October 7th was the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. But isn't it worth, I'm certainly not excusing what happened on October 7th, but isn't it worth noting that in the Holocaust, 6 million Jews died, and on October 7th, it was, 1,200 or 1,500 Jews?
Yeah.
That's obviously not an excuse, but they're entirely different conceptually.
Oh, I'm not, of course, absolutely. I'm not
comparing the two is slightly absurd.
Well, no, I don't think it's a comparison. It's saying that this is the biggest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. This is a factual statement. Maybe if you wanted to compare it to other pogroms that happened before the Holocaust, it's much bigger than any pogrom in Europe in the early 20th century, which was the era of late 19th, early 20th centuries, which was the the first pogrom was in the early 20th century. So yeah, it's bigger than any pogrom.
What do you think about all the campus demonstrations? You're pretty outspoken on what's happening on US campuses. You've written a considerable amount about it. What about the student who isn't against the Jew, doesn't really know very much about Jews one way or the other, student who's simply offended by what's happening now in Gaza and believes that it's the equivalent of Vietnam, and that America, given that it claims to be always representing justice, is actually doing the work of injustice? Is there any argument for you in this, in the campus demonstrations against US support, military support for Israel?
No, I think these young people are very morally confused. They don't seem to understand that it was Hamas that started this war, that there was peace before October 7th. I don't see any calls among these protesters for the release of any hostages, which would end this war if they surrendered and released the hostages that are being held in captivity for 7 months now. We've seen open displays of support for Hamas and Hezbollah. So these are not peace demonstrations, okay? I want to be very clear about this. They are pro-war demonstrations. They are pro-Hamas demonstrations. You may see, scattered calls for a ceasefire here or there, but that doesn't really describe the character of these protesters. You know, if I were to be charitable, I would call them useful idiots, and that they don't really know what's going on and they're just kind of spouting slogans. But I think really the realistic description of these people is that they are brainwashed. They've been brainwashed by a far left progressive ideology in their university classes. I think most of it, frankly, is not necessarily anti-Semitic in intent. I think it's downstream of anti-white racism, because anti-white racism is so crucial to this, if you want to call it wokeness or progressive DEI ideology. It's anti-white. It's about denigrating white people, and
So
below that, what Jews are considered in this, Jews are considered white in this schema, even though we weren't considered white in Germany in the 1930s or 1940s. We haven't been considered white in most of the places and most of the times that Jews have lived. Racial schema, Jews are considered white. Israel is the white country. Palestine is the BIPOC country, the Black, Indigenous, people of color country. And therefore, the white country is evil and must be destroyed. That's where I think most of these kids, that's what I think explains most of their activism.
So in other words, Asians are the new Jews and Jews are the new whites, Jamie.
In a way, yes.
We got 3 titles. I have to figure that one out. So in all seriousness, everyone, and I'm sure this includes you, are deeply troubled by the suffering of Palestinian people, non-Hamas civilians, women and children, men, old men, young men in Gaza. If you care about Palestinians suffering, which anyone, it seems, I mean, you'd have to be inhuman not to care.
Absolutely.
And you're not against the Jews, blah, blah, blah. What, in your view, should you be doing?
You should be wishing for the extirpation of Hamas, the elimination of Hamas. Hamas started this. Hamas now is responsible for every civilian death in this war. Because Hamas, it puts its men and materials in mosques, in schools, in hospitals. We know this. And if Hamas is allowed to remain in power, what will it do? Well, just listen to its leaders. They've said we will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1,000 October 7th. So if Hamas is allowed to remain in power, they will regroup, they will become strong again, and they will start another war, or they'll do another October 7th somehow. They will do something to provoke the Israelis into another war that will lead to even more Palestinian deaths. So I think it's better to look at what's going on right now in Gaza as Israel liberating Gazans from Hamas. And we should hope that that succeeds. And we should hope that the response of the Palestinian people to this is what the Germans and the Japanese did after World War II, which was to...
So are you suggesting that they're Nazis and that the relationship between people and Hamas is the equivalent between the German people and the Nazis?
I think it is similar to that, yes. And I think there will need to be a very thoroughgoing de-Hamasification of Gaza after this war. How that happens, maybe it's from the more moderate Arab regimes do that. I don't know how that happens, but you know what? That's frankly not, that's the Palestinians' responsibility, is that they move on from this destructive ideology. Because as long as they wallow in it, they're just gonna, bring more misery upon themselves.
This doesn't seem very realistic, does it, though, in all seriousness? I mean, the chances, firstly, my sense is, and again, I'm not really an expert, is that many Palestinians may not be completely sympathetic to everything that Hamas says and does, but they still have some faith in the organization, and there aren't any alternatives anyway. What is it, the Palestinian Authority, which makes Joe Biden look young?
Yeah, well, again, you know what? The Germans and the Japanese made very well of themselves after World War II. They rebuilt their societies, and they are now 2 of the most admired, successful democracies in the world. So if the Palestinians want to follow that path, they have the opportunity. If they want to follow the Hamas path again, they have that opportunity too. It's not up to me or the Israelis to force them into any decision. So if you don't think it's realistic, and I probably agree.
A U.S. Marshall Plan, because of course the Germans and the Japanese didn't do it alone.
Yeah.
There was massive investment from the U.S. Should there be a U.S. Marshall Plan to rebuild Palestine?
I don't think it should be U.S. I think it should be led by the Arab regime. The Arab regimes that were largely responsible for the plight of the Palestinians, right? It was the Arab regimes that in 1948 went to war against Israel and did it again in 67 and did it again in 73 and never helped the Palestinians, right? They didn't let Palestinians into their countries. In Lebanon, Palestinian refugees can't own land. UNRWA, right? The whole UN refugee agency for Palestinians. The Palestinians are the only people who get inherited refugee status, right? They're not resettled into other Arab countries. So if the Arab countries want to continue that, then they owe it to the Palestinians to invest in Palestinian civil society, in the Palestinian economy. They certainly have the money to do that. Okay, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, those countries all have the resources to do that. And I think it's up to them, if they're really serious about helping the benighted Palestinian people, it's up to them to do something about it.
Well, finally, Jamie, let's end on a more cheerful, positive note. This is a terrible story for everyone. You had an interesting piece in Airmail about Salman Rushdie's last book and what the headline describes as Rushdie's triumph. And Rushdie, of course, and the Satanic Verses case was a publishing event as well. What can we learn from Salman Rushdie's triumph, his ability to speak truly to power about his view of justice? I'm not sure where Rushdie is actually on the current situation in Gaza.
Well, it's very interesting. It's very interesting where he is, because he gave an interview to Bild, the German newspaper, last week. And Rushdie, who's been a long-time supporter of the Palestinian cause and a very strong critic of the state of Israel.
And a close friend of Edward Said, of course.
Yeah, he said that he does not believe in the creation of a Palestinian state anymore. Maybe in the future, in some theoretical future, but he said right now, a Palestinian state would be like a Taliban state. It would be a satrapy of Iran. So I think that's a major development in sort of the world of letters, that this very respected author, who's a man of the left and a very proud man of the left, would come out and say that. I think that's a very important signal moment, I would say, actually. And it's not getting a lot of press coverage because I think it's very uncomfortable for people to acknowledge that he said that. Now, I would say, you asked me what can we learn from Rushdie? I think what I most admire about him is that, and this, I don't mean to say this in a kind of morbid way. If the fatwa had to be placed on any writer, we're extremely lucky that it was placed on Salman Rushdie. And I say that only because, obviously he's been tormented by this for decades, but he is a man of such integrity and courage. The vast majority of writers under that situation would slink away. They'd stay in hiding. They would change their name. They would stop writing. They would just do whatever they had to do to kind of get away from the spotlight that the fatwa put on them, and the real danger that it put on them. And he never did that. He never did that. And he's such a remarkable person for that. And I really think he is the conscience of every writer in the world today. He really is our conscience. He's our North Star, because he has endured more than any of us. I mean, obviously there are writers in prison who endure a lot for their in many countries, right?
It's about him being stabbed on stage and being blinded.
Stabbed in the eye, right? But that doesn't happen to a lot of writers, getting stabbed in the eye. You know what? So I just think that whatever you think of his political views, whatever you think of his literature, you might think he's not a good writer, but just merely living and existing in the way that he has, I can say personally, as a writer, he's really one of my heroes, and I just admire him to no end.